Helen called at 4:17 in the afternoon on the day of Dorothy's funeral, which was the same day we had buried my wife of 43 years in the red clay of Pensacola, Florida, and which I was still processing in the specific way you process a thing that is too large for a single afternoon. I was sitting in the kitchen of the house on Cervantes Street when the phone rang. The neighbors had brought food, which is what neighbors do in the South, and the counters had food on them that I had not touched. Patricia was in the living room with her husband and their 2 children. The house had the particular quality that houses have in the hours after a funeral, inhabited and quiet at the same time, full of people, and somehow emptier than it has ever been. Helen's name on the screen, Dorothy's younger sister. 64 years old, sharp in the way of the Weston women, which was the family Dorothy had come from, and which ran to directness and a low tolerance for circling around things. I answered. She said, "Thomas, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it completely before you say anything." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "I spoke with Margaret Forsythe this morning. I know about the will. I know Dorothy changed it 3 days before she died, and that Curtis has been removed from the distribution entirely. I know he gets nothing." A pause. The particular pause of a woman who is waiting to see how a man receives information she believes will devastate him. She said, "Thomas, I don't know how to tell you how sorry I am. Curtis must have done something, or Dorothy must have been confused near the end, and I just want you to know that whatever happened, we can look into it. Margaret said there may be ways to—" I said, "Helen." She stopped. I said, "I already know about the will." A longer pause. The specific silence of someone recalibrating what they thought they were walking into. She said, "You knew?" I said, "I knew." She said, "How did you?" I said, "Because I was the one who asked her to do it." The silence that followed that sentence was not a short one. Helen Weston, who had been talking clearly and quickly since she dialed, had nothing in the immediate aftermath of those words. I could hear her breathing. I could hear, underneath the breathing, the specific sound of a person revising the story they had walked into a conversation with. She said finally, "Thomas, what does that mean?" I said, "It means Dorothy and I made that decision together. It means I sat with my wife 3 days before she died, and we talked about what we both knew and what we both wanted, and at the end of that conversation she called Margaret Forsythe. It means the will says what it says, because we both agreed it should say that, and it was Dorothy's name on the document, and Dorothy's hand on the pen, and Dorothy's decision, but it was a decision I asked her to make, and one she had already been moving toward on her own for longer than you know." Helen was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Curtis doesn't know yet." I said, "No, Curtis does not know yet." She said, "When is he going to find out?" I said, "He was at the reception this afternoon, asking me how I was doing. He is coming over tomorrow morning to talk about what he called the estate situation. He will find out tomorrow morning." She said, "Thomas, what did he do?" I said, "Helen, that is the story, and it is going to take me a while to tell it." She said, "I have time." I said, "Not tonight. Come for coffee on Saturday. I will tell you everything." She came for coffee on Saturday. I told her everything. This is that story. My name is Thomas Aldridge. I am 72 years old. I live in Pensacola, Florida. My wife died on a Tuesday in October, and we buried her on Friday, and I sat in her kitchen on the afternoon of her funeral and told her sister that I had been the one to ask Dorothy to remove our son from her will. And what I want you to understand, before I tell you what Curtis did, is that this was not a decision I made in anger. It was not a decision I made quickly. It was a decision I made after 22 months of watching something happen in my own house that I am going to describe with the same precision that I brought to the 38 years I spent as a licensed pharmacist, which is to say, exactly, completely, and without approximation. Welcome to True Story. Hit that subscribe button and drop your city in the comments below. We read every single one. Now let me tell you what Curtis did. I spent 38 years as a licensed pharmacist in Pensacola, Florida, the first 14 at a chain pharmacy on Davis Highway, and the last 24 as the owner and pharmacist of Aldridge Pharmacy on Palafox Street, an independent that I had opened in 1998 with a partner who retired in 2007 and whose half I bought out at a fair price, and continued running until I sold it in 2019 to a regional pharmacy group that had been asking about it for 3 years. A pharmacist's professional mind is organized around one central discipline, which is the discipline of interactions. Drugs interact. Conditions interact. A patient's history interacts with their current situation in ways that are not always visible on the surface, and that require the person looking at the full record to understand what the parts are doing to each other. You develop, over 38 years, a specific sensitivity to the thing that does not quite fit the expected pattern, the detail that is inconsistent with the rest of the information, the combination that should not be producing the outcome it is producing. I also learned, over 38 years of reviewing prescriptions and patient histories and dosage records, that the most dangerous errors are not the dramatic ones. They are the incremental ones, the small adjustments that each seem reasonable in isolation and that add up, over time, to a cumulative deviation that cannot be corrected without going back to the original specification and starting the correction from there. The pharmacist's job is to catch the deviation before it becomes the event. I had been catching this particular deviation for 22 months before I named it to Dorothy. The notebook was the record I was keeping in case the catch needed to be documented. Dorothy Louise Aldridge, born Dorothy Louise Weston in Mobile, Alabama, in 1950, was my wife for 43 years, and the finest person I have had the privilege of knowing at close range. She was a third-grade teacher for 26 years at Cordova Park Elementary in Pensacola, and she brought to that work the same quality she brought to everything in her life, which was the complete and unsentimental conviction that people were capable of more than they currently understood about themselves, and that it was the job of the person in front of them to hold that conviction steadily enough that they eventually absorbed it. She was not soft. I want to be precise about this because it is important to the story. Dorothy was warm, and she was kind, and she was generous, in the way that a person who has genuinely thought about what generosity costs, and has decided it is worth the cost, is generous. But she was not soft. She had the specific spine of a woman who had grown up in a Baptist preacher's house, where the standards were clear, and the application of them was consistent, and where the distance between what you said and what you did was noticed, and remembered, by everyone in the room. She had also, in 43 years of marriage, kept a kind of internal ledger on the people she loved that I had come to understand was different from my own. Mine was conscious and analytical, the pharmacist's record. Hers was something more instinctive and more complete. She noticed things that I did not notice, and she held them in a place that I did not have access to, until she chose to show me what was in it. What she showed me, beginning in May of 2021 and continuing through the fall, was what Curtis had been doing, not confrontationally, not with drama. She would say it the way she said most important things, at the kitchen table with coffee, in the middle of an ordinary conversation that had not appeared to be moving toward the thing she was about to say. She would say, "Curtis asked me about the Gulf Shores property this afternoon," and then she would say what he had asked, precisely, and then she would look at me, and let the precision of the account speak for itself. I had 2 children. Patricia was 40 years old, lived in Atlanta, where she worked in hospital administration, and had her mother's internal ledger and her mother's spine. She had called every Tuesday and Thursday for 3 years since Dorothy's diagnosis without being asked. She had driven up from Atlanta 12 times in 22 months, always with a specific reason to justify the trip, and always staying longer than the specific reason required. She had never once asked about the estate. Not once, in 3 years of her mother's illness, had a question about what would happen to what her parents had built entered any conversation Patricia had initiated. I mention this because the contrast matters, and because the contrast was not something I had manufactured or encouraged. It was simply who Patricia was, in the way that some people are exactly who they are without calculation. Curtis Allen Aldridge was 45. He lived in Gulf Breeze, which is the community across the bay from Pensacola on the western end of the Panhandle, in a house he had purchased in 2016 and that he shared with his wife Karen and their teenage son. He worked in commercial insurance, which gave him a professional fluency in asset valuation and risk assessment that I had, in retrospect, probably underweighted as a variable in understanding his orientation toward the estate question. He was not a bad person. I want to be careful about that, because this story requires that precision. He was not the villain of a simple story. He was a person who had organized himself, over time, around a specific set of priorities, and those priorities had, in the context of his mother's illness, produced a pattern of behavior that was not consistent with who he presented himself as being. That inconsistency was what I had been documenting. Not cruelty, not open malice, the quiet, patient, systematic behavior of a man who had been doing the math on a situation and had decided to position himself favorably within it while performing a different kind of attention for the audience in the room. The performing was the part that was hardest to sit with, not the math. The performance. The diagnosis came after a November scan that had flagged something and a December biopsy that had confirmed what the scan suggested. The oncologist at Sacred Heart was direct and thorough, and described the situation with a clinical honesty that I respected, even though the honesty was difficult to receive. The staging was not early. The treatment plan was aggressive. The timeline was, in the careful language of a thorough physician, not something she was willing to predict with specificity. Dorothy received the news the way she received difficult things, which was by being quiet for a day and then deciding what she was going to do about it. She was not dramatic. She was the daughter of a Baptist preacher from Mobile, Alabama, who had lived 82 years before he died and who had said, at his daughter's wedding, that Dorothy had been born facing forward and had never once turned around to look at what was behind her. He had been right. She faced forward through the diagnosis and the treatment and the 18 months that followed it with the same steady attention she had brought to everything else she had ever done. She told the children in February. Patricia drove up from Atlanta the following weekend and spent 3 days at the house and cried privately and was steady publicly and spent her time doing the practical things that needed doing around a situation like this, which was very much Patricia. Curtis drove over from his house in Gulf Breeze, which was 40 minutes away, stayed for dinner, expressed appropriate distress, and drove home. He began calling more frequently after that. Not every day, but more than he had been calling. The calls were warm and attentive, in the specific way that warmth and attention can be when they are being applied intentionally rather than offered naturally. He visited more. He brought things, food, flowers, small practical items that Dorothy might need, and he presented them with the specific visible care of a man who wanted the presentation to be seen. I noticed it. I noted the change in frequency without yet attaching a conclusion to the notation. That is the pharmacist's discipline. You do not conclude from a single data point. You note it and you watch for what follows. What followed was a conversation in March, 2 months after the diagnosis. Curtis came for Sunday dinner, and afterward, while Dorothy was resting, he sat with me in the living room and asked about the house. He framed it as practical planning. He said he had been thinking about what would make sense logistically, given the situation, and whether Dorothy and I had thought about how things were organized in terms of the estate. He said he wasn't trying to be morbid. He said he just wanted to make sure we had thought about everything so that there wasn't any confusion down the road. Down the road. I said we had an estate attorney and everything was in order and that I appreciated him thinking about it. He said, of course. And he said something else warm that I do not remember specifically, and the conversation moved on. I went to the desk in the study that evening, and I started a new notebook. I wrote down the date and what he had said, as precisely as I could reconstruct it. I wrote it the way I would have written a drug interaction note, without interpretation, just the specific information. I did not tell Dorothy about the notebook, not yet. I did not know yet what I was building toward, and I did not want to add the weight of a suspicion to what she was already carrying. The notebook grew. In April he asked, in the context of a conversation about the pharmacy sale proceeds, whether those funds had been structured into the estate or whether they were held separately. The question was phrased as curiosity. He had a friend, he said, who had recently gone through a similar situation with his father's business sale and had encountered some complications, and he just wanted to make sure we had thought about the structure. In May, he asked Dorothy, not me, about the vacation property we owned in Gulf Shores, Alabama, a small house on the bay that we had bought in 2004, and that we used for a few weeks every summer, and that the grandchildren had spent every summer of their lives visiting. He asked Dorothy whether she had thought about what she wanted to happen with it. He framed this as love, as not wanting there to be conflict among the family after she was gone, as wanting to honor whatever she wanted while she was still able to say what she wanted. Dorothy told me about this conversation the same evening. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, and she looked at me with the expression she had worn across 43 years of dinner tables, and she said, "Curtis asked me about the Gulf Shores house today." I said, "I know." She said, "He's been asking about things." I said, "I know that too." She said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Since March." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been watching it for longer than that." That was the first time we named it between us. We sat at the kitchen table on Cervantes Street in Pensacola, with the Gulf breeze coming through the window, and we talked, for the first time, about what we were both watching, and what we both understood about what it meant. Dorothy said, "He loves me. I want to be clear that I believe that. But what he's doing isn't coming from love. What he's doing is coming from the part of him that has always organized his relationships around what they might provide. And right now what I might provide has a deadline on it, and he can feel the deadline." She said this without bitterness. That was Dorothy. She named things precisely and without excess emotion, and she did not require the naming to be dramatic in order for it to be true. I said, "What do you want to do about it?" She said, "I want to think about it, and I want you to keep watching." I kept watching. I kept the notebook. Summer passed and fall came, and Dorothy's treatment continued, and produced periods of response, and periods of difficulty, and through all of it, Curtis's attentiveness remained elevated, and specific in its focus, and consistent in its direction, which was always, in one form or another, toward the question of what Dorothy had, and what was going to happen to it. In October of 2021, 9 months after the diagnosis, I found something in the phone records that I had not been looking for, and that changed the character of what I was watching, from suspicious to documented. The hospital's patient portal had been accessed from an IP address that was not mine, not Dorothy's, and not Patricia's. I discovered this because Sacred Heart's patient portal had a login activity log that was accessible from the account settings, and I had been checking it periodically since August as a general security precaution after a hospital in another city had been in the news for a data breach. I was not checking it for this reason. I was checking it because I was a pharmacist, and I had spent 38 years in a data-sensitive field, and the habit of checking access logs was not something I turned off when I retired. The portal had been accessed 6 times over a 3-month period, beginning in July. The access had been from a device I did not recognize on an IP address I did not recognize. I noted the IP address. I ran it through a tool available to anyone with a browser, and 3 minutes, which is a reverse IP lookup, and the result returned a residential service area in Gulf Breeze, Florida. I sat with that for 2 weeks. I want to tell you why I sat with it for 2 weeks, rather than calling Margaret Forsyth the same afternoon. Because the 2 weeks are not a period of inaction. They are the period during which I did what I had trained myself to do across 38 years, which was to verify the finding before acting on it. A single data point can have alternative explanations. I needed to eliminate the alternative explanations before I proceeded. I checked Dorothy's browser history on the laptop she used for her own portal access. She had not accessed the portal from a Gulf Breeze location. I checked whether the hospital system had any technical reason why a login might appear to originate from a different geographic area than the user's actual location. It did not. I checked whether Curtis had been at our house and used our Wi-Fi during any of the 6 access dates, which would have produced a different IP address than his home, but which was worth ruling out. He had not been at our house on any of those dates, which I confirmed against the calendar Dorothy kept on the refrigerator and against my own phone records of his visits. The finding held. Curtis had been accessing his mother's medical records without authorization. 6 times, over 3 months. Reading her scan results and her oncology notes, and the most recent documentation of her prognosis. What he did with what he read came out of the phone records. Dorothy's attorney subpoenaed them after the will change, as part of the documentation process Margaret recommended to establish the record of what had prompted the revision. The phone records showed a series of calls between Curtis and a contact identified as Dennis W. 14 calls over the same 3-month window, with call durations ranging from 12 minutes to 47 minutes. Margaret's investigative contact identified Dennis W. as a certified financial planner operating out of an office in Pensacola, who specialized in estate planning and trust management. Curtis had been consulting a financial planner about his expected inheritance while reading his dying mother's prognosis documentation without her knowledge or consent. Those two facts, sitting beside each other in the record Margaret assembled, were the facts that made the will change not just defensible, but necessary. The conversation between Dorothy and Margaret happened in our living room, with Dorothy in the chair by the window where she had been spending most of her time by then, and me on the sofa, and Margaret at the kitchen table with her files. Dorothy told her everything, the visits and the questions and the portal access and the phone records. Margaret listened without interrupting the way a thorough professional listens, and when Dorothy finished, Margaret asked 2 clarifying questions, and then was quiet for a moment. She said, "Dorothy, I want to ask you what outcome you want, not what you think you should want, what you actually want." Dorothy said, "I want to know that what Thomas and I built together goes where we decided it should go, not where Curtis has been positioning himself for it to go." Margaret said, "Then let me tell you what your options are." The options were straightforward and legal, and available to a person of sound mind, making clear decisions about the distribution of her own estate, which Dorothy was. Margaret described them. Dorothy listened. I listened. At the end of the description, Dorothy looked at me across the living room with the look that had been crossing kitchen tables and living rooms between us for 43 years, and she said, "Thomas, what do you think?" I said, "I think you should do what is right, and I think you know what is right." She said, "I need you to tell me directly, because what I'm thinking about doing changes what Curtis inherits entirely, and I need to know you're with me on it." I said, "Dorothy, I am the one asking you to do it." That was the conversation. 3 days later, Dorothy met with Margaret and executed the revised documents. 2 days after that, on a Tuesday morning in October, my wife of 43 years died in the chair by the window, with the Gulf breeze coming through, and Patricia beside her, and my hand in hers. Curtis was in the house within the hour. He was at the reception after the funeral, moving through the room with the practiced warmth that was his social instrument, accepting condolences, making the right sounds, looking like what he needed to look like in that room. He told me twice that afternoon that he was going to be there for me through all of this. He said we would get through it together as a family. I said I appreciated it. I looked at his face, and I thought about the portal access, and the financial advisor calls, and the Sunday dinner in March, when he had asked about the estate, with the language of practical planning, and I thought about Dorothy in the chair by the window, with the Gulf breeze, and her hand in mine on the last morning. He said he would come over the next day to talk about what she called the estate situation. I said that was fine. I said to come at 10. He came at 10. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Dorothy and I had first named what was happening, and he had a yellow legal pad with him, which I noted, and a pen, and the composed and gentle expression of a man who has organized himself for a difficult but necessary conversation. He said he wanted to start by saying again how much he loved his mother. He said he wanted to handle everything with the respect she deserved. He said he had been thinking about what she would have wanted, and he wanted to make sure that what happened with the estate honored that. I let him finish. Then I said, "Curtis, Margaret Forsyth is the executor. You'll need to contact her office to discuss anything related to the estate." He said, "Of course, yes, but I just wanted to get a sense of," he paused, "of what we're working with, what she intended." I said, "Margaret will walk you through what Dorothy intended." He called Margaret's office at 11:15. I know this because Margaret called me at 11:40 to tell me he had called and to let me know the conversation had gone as expected, which was Margaret's way of telling me he had received the information and that the information had produced the response. That information like that produces in a person who has been organizing themselves around a different outcome. He called me at noon. He did not use the warm voice. He used a different voice, the voice underneath the warm one, the voice that comes out when the room has been cleared of everyone else. He said, "Dad, what happened to the will?" I said, "You need to talk to Margaret about the specifics." He said, "Margaret told me I'm not in it. She told me Dorothy revised the will 3 days before she died, and that I'm not in it." I said, "I know." He said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because I asked her to do it." The silence on the phone was a longer version of the silence on the phone with Helen 2 days earlier. The same specific quality of a person revising the story they were inside. He said, "You asked her. You asked your dying wife to cut your own son out of her will." I said, "I sat with your mother 3 days before she died, and we talked about what we both knew, and what we both wanted. The decision was hers, the request was mine. Those are both true." He said, "What do you think you know?" I said, "Curtis, I know about the portal access. I know about the 6 times you accessed your mother's medical records without authorization. I know about the phone calls with your financial advisor contact in the 3 months after you started accessing those records. I know about March when you asked me about the estate structure. I know about May when you asked your mother about the Gulf Shores property. I know about all of it, because I have been keeping a notebook since March of last year, and your mother knew most of it before I told her the rest." The silence this time was different. Not the silence of revision, the silence of recognition. He said, "She knew." I said, "She knew. And she made her decision with full knowledge of what she knew. I am not going to characterize her decision for you. You can think whatever you want to think about it. What I want you to understand is that it was her decision, made clearly, with legal counsel, while she was in complete possession of herself. Margaret can tell you that. The notary who witnessed it can tell you that. The documentation is as solid as any document Margaret has ever prepared, and she has been preparing documents for a long time." He said, "I'm going to contest it." I said, "That is your right. Margaret can tell you what the evidentiary landscape of that contest looks like." He did not respond to that immediately. I could hear him thinking, which is a sound that does not translate well into a description, but that a father recognizes in a son he has known for 45 years. He said, "Dad, did you consider what this does to our relationship?" I said, "Curtis, I considered what your behavior over the past 22 months did to your relationship with your mother. I considered it carefully and at length, and I considered what your mother would have chosen to do with the information she had about that behavior. The will reflects what she chose." He hung up. I set the phone down on the kitchen table, and I looked at the chair by the window where Dorothy used to sit, and where the light came through in the morning, in the way she had said, when we were looking at houses in 1994, was the thing she most wanted in a kitchen, the morning light. She had been right that this house had it, and she had been right about most things, and the chair was still there, and the light came through it in the morning the same way it always had. Patricia came downstairs at 12:30. She had been there since the funeral, staying in her old room, being present the way she was always present. She came to the kitchen table and sat down across from me, and looked at me the way her mother used to look at me across tables, and she said, "He called?" I said, "He called." She said, "How did it go?" I said, "The way it needed to go." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom knew what she was doing." I said, "She always knew what she was doing, right up to the end. That was your mother." She put her hand on the table, not toward me, just on the table, the way people make themselves present sometimes, without requiring anything of the gesture. We sat in the kitchen for a while, with the morning light coming through the window, and the neighbors' food on the counters, and the quiet of a house that has held something enormous and is learning to be ordinary again. Curtis did not contest the will. Margaret had been correct that the documentation was as solid as she had ever prepared, and whoever Curtis had consulted about the evidentiary landscape of a contest had given him the same assessment in different language. He called me in December, not about the estate. He called because it was the holidays and because, I think, the months since October had produced in him some version of the accounting that the will change had been designed to produce. Not remorse exactly, something more specific. The understanding of what had been visible from the outside and what that visibility had cost. He did not apologize for the portal access. He did not mention the financial advisor calls. What he said was that he had been in a difficult place for a long time, and that he had not always operated from his best self in that difficulty. He said he understood that his mother had seen things he had not known she was seeing. I said, "She saw everything, Curtis. She always saw everything. She just chose when to act on what she saw." He said, "Was she angry?" I said, "No, she wasn't angry. That was not who she was about the people she loved. She was sad. She was sad about what she had seen and sad about the choice she had to make. And she made it clearly and without anger. That was the most Dorothy thing she ever did." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I want to come visit, after the new year, if that's okay." I said, "The door is not closed. It has never been closed. What has changed is the arrangement, not the relationship." He said he understood. He said he would call after the new year. Helen came for coffee on the Saturday after the funeral, as I had said she would. I told her everything. The notebook and the portal access, and the financial advisor and the conversation in the living room, and what Dorothy had said to Margaret. Helen listened the way the Weston women listened, completely and without interruption, and when I finished, she sat with her coffee for a moment and looked at the chair by the window. She said, "She would have told me eventually." I said, "She would have. She was working up to it. She had a way of sequencing things." Helen said, "I called you because I thought you didn't know, and I wanted you to be prepared. I came in with completely the wrong story." I said, "You came in with the story you had. I had a different story." She said she asked you to ask her to do it. That's what I'm understanding. I said she had already decided. She needed me to tell her I was in agreement. She needed it to be ours and not just hers. That was Dorothy. She did not want to carry something like that alone. Helen looked at the window again. The morning light was doing what it always did in that kitchen. She said, "She found the right man." I said, "She found the right kitchen window too. She always said that was the deciding factor on this house." She smiled. Dorothy's sister's smile, which had just enough of Dorothy in it that I had to look away for a moment and look at the window instead. The will says what it says. The estate is where it belongs. The notebooks, mine and Vera's ledger books, and the documentation Margaret prepared, are in the filing cabinet in the study, in the order they were always in. Patricia has copies of everything. 43 years. That is a long time to know someone. It is long enough to know, without being told, when a decision needs to be made, and how to sit beside a person in a chair by a window and ask them to make it. Long enough to know that the asking is not the betrayal. The betrayal was the portal access, and the financial advisor calls, and the Sunday dinner questions, and the 22 months of positioning that preceded them. The will was the correction. Dorothy signed it herself. She knew what she was signing. She died 3 days later, with full clarity and full peace, and with Patricia beside her, and my hand in hers, and the Gulf breeze coming through the window she had chosen in 1994, because of the morning light. That is the whole story. Every part of it is documented, and every part of it is true. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment below, and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Hit that like button, subscribe if you are not already here, and I will see you in the next one. True Story uploads every week. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss one.